Asking blue pill, red pill, corporate press, I've had my fill. I'm just a simple chap, believing in my own will. Web fire, math, evil scheming, this is no drill. Haters masking boosted, but still with no chill. Need to come and take it if you wanna mess with my hill. We've been 3D printing, setting ready for that ghost kill.
Hello, Canada, and welcome to another episode of The Maple Pill. As always, I'm your host, Matt McKeever. Hope you're having it's Tuesday, right? A good Tuesday night. Episode 52, we've got a full course of The Maple Pill to cover. As well, we're going to sprinkle in a couple of little comments in regards to the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest. And I guess the first thing I really just want to chat with you guys about, I was kind of going down memory lane looking at some of our previous broadcasts, particularly around the Freedom Trucker Convoy. And all of a sudden I remember the whole dude that hacked Give, Send, Go and claimed, he was a Canadian and he was the one responsible for it. He literally did, I think, a TikTok live where he was bragging about his hacking and doxing of the donators. Whatever happened to that guy? Why didn't mainstream media ever cover that? Interesting, isn't it? Anyways, enough of the memory lane. We'll jump into tonight's first story. And so the first story we're going to be covering, that's a blue pill story, but I would love to hear if you guys heard of any updates around that. Let me know in the comment section, or let me know on the Maple Pill channel on the Problems for Profits Discord. Link to that in the video description down below, because I don't remember seeing anything over these last couple of weeks. And you think, if the Canadian police have enough time to be demanding Randy Hillier turn himself in, to be, laying on more charges onto Tamara Litch, well, they seem to just find no culprits for the gas pipeline attack that we covered yesterday, from way back, that's 40 days old now. You think they could at least get around to going after that hacker or finding out if he is the one responsible. Again, he seemed a little bit maybe is actually understatement. He seemed very mentally unstable. So who knows? That could have just been, a troll. These days, it's so hard to tell fact from fiction. But anyways, let's jump into the first blue pill story from Reuters. Canada to present its 2022 budget next week as inflation soars. So just wanted to highlight this. It will be interesting to see what the Liberal budget looks like. We'll be finding out April 7th. And one of the reasons I think it's important for us to pay attention here, this is going to be kind of the Liberal / NDP budget this time, right? One of the things that we're definitely expecting to see in this budget is dental care being rolled out across Canada. So again, I'd love to hear your thoughts, your opinions on what to expect in this budget. One spoiler alert, it's definitely not going to balance itself, but it will be interesting to see their trajectory and projections on when they expect to maybe actually balance the budget. Again, right now, the NDP and Liberals have that partnership that'll presumably see them through to 2025. I'm willing to bet that we won't see a balanced budget through 2025. But again, that doesn't necessarily surprise me. Even if it was solely the Liberals in charge, I would still expect them to focus on deficit spending. But again, link to this Reuters article, as well as all the articles we're going to cover tonight, in the video description down below. Next, this is from Reuters. Investors expect Bank of Canada shift to 0.5 percentage point rate hikes. So just want to highlight this because I'm seeing more and more, I guess, static or coverage of this subject matter among the mainstream press and amongst mainstream analysts. You guys know my opinion. I'd be shocked to see them move this big, but again, time will tell. My crystal ball is not perfect, just like everyone else's. However, to expect a 50 basis point hike and multiple 50 basis point hikes this year, again, certainly outside of what we've experienced over the last couple of years, and would show a very much more serious stance, I guess I'll say, for Canada Central Bank in regards to how it's reacting to inflation. Now, again, while I say that I don't think they have the balls to pull this off, that doesn't even mean that it's a bad idea, right? I think that I know that we've had artificially low interest rates for an extended period of time, and that's caused all kinds of unintended consequences, right? So certainly it's probably justified to want to raise interest rates dramatically this year. However, will the Canadian economy, and particularly the real estate market, respond to this is yet to be seen. If we literally saw 50 basis points followed by another 50 basis points within a 3-month time span, because the Bank of Canada meets every month and a half, that would be pretty dramatic. That would shift the tides of real estate, in my opinion. And it would be interesting to see how the real estate market reacts to it. Right now, we've covered in the past, there's a handful of articles from mainstream media trying to signal that maybe the real estate market's softening. And while I hear of some edge case stories and anecdotal stories from amongst most real estate investors, it seems like their markets are still humming along. But again, if we see these massive increases in interest rates, that could really change things. And let me know if you guys are a real estate investor. Are you paying attention to this? Does this concern you? Do you have variable mortgages, or are you locked in fixed and you don't really give a shit? Let me know in that comment section. Next blue pill story. Experts say Quebec has entered a sixth wave of COVID-19 propelled by the BA2 subvariant. So we were talking about the BA2 subvariant before it was even cool. Feels like months ago, but it was probably just right before or right at the start of the Freedom Trucker Convoy. But just wanted to highlight this because mainstream media is trying to prep you. Maybe there's more lockdowns, and that means more news headlines. That means more scare, more panic, and more fear mongering, which will hopefully, drum up more attention for mainstream media. Because at this point in time, I don't know. I'm just so exhausted of COVID that unless I literally witness someone firsthand just drop dead in front of me, I can't get it up anymore. I can't get my motivation, my attention up in regards to COVID-19. I'm just done. No longer interested in it. And the sooner we just move on from all the silliness, the better. But I can't help but feel, and we'll cover this in a story later on tonight, that they can't, right? They being the administration, politicians, health officials, they can't just magically wave their wand and let's go back to normal, because the cognizant dissonance that would occur amongst those that got vaxxed, that got boosted, that are double boosted, that are, waiting until the release of the third booster so they can get it immediately. I think it would be too challenging to their ego and identity at this point in time. They've literally structured a lot, in my opinion, at least a handful of people, and certainly seems like very active people on social media with blue check marks. They seem to have actively constructed their reality around one or two key values, right? I've got multiple needles in my name or bio, and I've got the Ukrainian flag. If it's not for those two things, who am I as a person? Seems to be kind of their perspective. I guess they usually have like the LGBTQ flag in there as well in their pronouns. But outside of those four factors, they don't really have much else going on. Now from global news, threats within Canada's spy service boosts attention to ideological domestic extremism. So I think this is a headline, and this is an angle we're going to see in mainstream media for the foreseeable future. I don't think they're ever going to let this go. And so just wanted to highlight this because this is kind of interesting, in my opinion. Documents reviewed by Global News suggest CSIS has gone from closing its right-wing extremism desk in 2016 to spending almost as much time and resources tracking ideological domestic extremism as religious terrorist groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda in 2021. So there's a lot to unpack there technically, but imagine going from 2016, where they're like, honestly, there's just no domestic extremists here in Canada. Let's shut her down, boys. To 6 years later, this is a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda. The same Al-Qaeda that now controls a country, right? The same Al-Qaeda that we essentially gave Afghanistan back to. Interesting. Again, I see regular references to Diagolon as one of the extremist movements here in Canada. I'm not sure if you guys have spent any time looking into Raging Dissident. That's the content creator behind Diagolon. I'd love to hear your hot takes. I've only watched a handful of Jeremy's programs. Whenever I do, he's usually talking about how Diagolon started off as, a joke, a meme, a kind of insider joke for his followers, which seems kind of reminiscent of the Proud Boys, right? My understanding is that's how the Proud Boys started out as well. And at this point in time, I don't really see any organized efforts around Diagolon, but hey, maybe I'm just not in the right Telegram chats. Let me know your exposure and your opinions on these communities, because I would be curious. And outside of that, like, what are the extremist groups, the domestic extremist groups here in Canada? Are you going to try and tell me Randy Hillier's one? Are you going to try and tell me the PPC party's one? Like, where are these extremists? Why didn't they show up to the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest, right? You would think that they'd be able to at least show up to that. And so just want to highlight this because, again, this is telling to me on how the narrative is presented to the average person. While convoy defenders loudly proclaimed the illegal protests were nonviolent, the Ontario Provincial Police determined the Ottawa occupation to be a national security threat as early as February 7th. The federal government invoked emergency powers the following week to allow police to freeze convoy funding and clear the protests. So the reason I want to highlight this sentence in particular is the way they frame it, right? While convoy defendants loudly proclaimed the illegal protests were nonviolent. No, we don't need to loudly defend or proclaim that. Those are just facts, right? Like, literally, it was nonviolent. The police had no violent charges at all. The most amount of violence we saw in Ottawa was horses trampling that old lady. The most violence we saw came from the police when they decided to shut it down, right? We covered this in previous stories, the rumors around shotguns and all that. And while the Ottawa police did their best to obfuscate the situation, to try and not actually, say what happened, when they were finally asked the third time by a member of parliament, they were like, yeah, okay, fine. We didn't find any guns. This was nonviolent. This isn't someone pretending that it's nonviolent. And this is what's so frustrating, because a lot of people that don't have 4 hours a day like I do to, parse through these news articles and do a live show, they're just going to read that and be like, oh yeah, I remember people saying it was nonviolent, but we did invoke the Emergencies Act. Yeah, we invoked the Emergencies Act for a nonviolent protest. Let that sink in. Again, if you guys want to read throughout this entire article, link in the video description down below, but we're going to keep rolling. Toronto Star, Facebook owner Meta to hire 2,500 in Canadian roles, create Toronto Engineering Hub. Not really a political story. I just want to highlight this because, 2,500 tech jobs in Canada, that's a net benefit, regardless of what, our views or opinions may be of Facebook or Meta in general. That actually is a net benefit for Canada. So, hey, there's a nice little blue pill story. But let's get into our first red pill story of the day. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you have already heard about this. But Lockheed Martin takes big step towards winning Canada jet race. And you might be thinking, Canada jet race? I feel like I heard about this in the past. Yeah. That's because back in 2015, essentially, Trudeau made it a part of his campaign to denounce Stephen Harper and the pointless costs and controversy around the F-35s, right? And now, let me think, 2015, it's 2022. So like 7 years later, we're going to get F-35s to replace the F-35s we were going to get in 2015. Gotcha. This is from the National Post. Ottawa's pointless odyssey to replace the F-35 with the F-35. I don't know if I want to spend too much time on this. It really is just silliness. And this is just highlighting government incompetence at its best, right? We covered in the past about the Canadian military and their programs to try and replace the handgun that they use. And that literally we went through this entire process, came to no conclusion. And compared to how Britain did it, Britain was able to pull this off in a couple of years. Meanwhile, in Canada, it's turned into a 10-year odyssey. Well, the hunt for these jets, again, has turned into a 10-year odyssey. And while in theory, the frugal version of me wants to be like, well, hey, if you delay that expense, that in theory should be a net positive, right, for Canada? And yeah, in theory it should be, but that's not the way it actually works out with these military contractors. Because understand, we would have hired so many consultants between now and then, and we would have dumped so much good money after bad money on these programs to only end up exactly where we started, while inflation's, through the roof. So we're going to end up paying a ton more for the same jets that we were planning to buy in 2015 that still have the same issues as what Trudeau was pointing out back in 2015. And again, this is just one sign of government incompetence. There's a lot of examples out there. So don't get too hung up on this individual case, but it feels very apropos for Canada in general when it comes to spending. Post Millennial also did an article on this. So flashback, Trudeau promised in 2015 to not buy jets. He just bought them in 2022. So again, this is literally the video from Trudeau back in 2015. I feel like we listen to Trudeau enough these days that we don't need to listen to him back in 2015. But if you guys want, there's a link in the video description down below. But essentially, he was bringing up a bunch of issues with it. And his supporters were lauding him for his intelligence and foresight. But it turns out we're still going to do exactly what Harper had originally planned. It's probably just going to cost us a lot more now. So there we are. Next from the Post Millennial, Jordan Peterson says Trudeau Liberals doubling down as the rest of the world sheds mask mandates. Why do you feel compelled to make so much of this? Omar Algebra doubles down as the rest of the world sheds mask mandates. And so one of the things that is interesting is, we're seeing Omar and other Canadian members of parliament really calling out those influencers that were flying to, was it like Cancun or Cuba, and they were partying on the airplane. And, it's the greatest scandal in Canadian history since the Freedom Trucker Convoy, or in parallel with it. I forget how the mainstream media is really presenting it. But this seems to be the most important thing that's in a lot of airplay in mainstream media. Meanwhile, I'm just kind of like, okay, yeah, some stupid teenagers and early 20-somethings were stupid while they were flying to presumably like an all-inclusive resort. I don't know. People are going to do stupid shit. I don't know if this is really as big of a deal as it's getting the coverage of. But one thing I did want to highlight in this that I think is interesting is Omar announced more good news for travelers. Starting April 1st, Canada will no longer require fully vaccinated travelers to provide a COVID-19 test to enter the country. Now, understand, just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean you can't have COVID-19. So this is actually nothing other than just grandstanding, right? This is literally just trying to play to their base to be like, look, because you were good boys and girls and did exactly what daddy government said when he demanded it of you, we're going to allow you not to have to take those silly tests when you come back to Canada. It's not about health. It's not about safety. It's about making sure that you at least feel like you slightly got rewarded because you cucked immediately when the government demanded it of you, unlike those other bad thought criminals that dare demand, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of medical choice, those crazy truckers and similar individuals of the same ilk. And so, again, I think this is important and worth highlighting here because this honestly, like, if it wasn't for the fact that I believe they're just trying to make it seem like a reward for those that played along to the COVID narrative throughout this pandemic, there's no actual justification for this, right? Like, they're not going to be able to point to a study or anything that's going to show why it would make sense to not get vaccinated versus unvaccinated people to have a COVID test to re-enter the country. It literally is not based in any science that we've seen. Maybe there's some deep reports that they don't want to release to us, but I don't think that's the case. Again, I think this is literally just playing to their base, trying to give a bone to the individuals that obeyed when it was demanded of them to obey. So again, very interesting. And I hope that this is, 2 weeks from now, we'll hear about them opening up more. I'm hoping that, again, I mentioned in the past, I've got a trip planned in May. I really hope that just magically the world gets its shit together, in Canada in particular, by getting rid of all these crazy restrictions. Because there's no justification for it. But we do live in the age of hilarious, and we are oftentimes in the clown timeline. So I don't know. Next from the Globe and Mail, many in Middle East see hypocrisy in Western embrace of Ukraine. And so I thought this was worth highlighting because honestly, mainstream media doesn't give it much play. We've chatted briefly about Yemen and then also Ethiopia. Again, straight up, Ethiopia was something that wasn't high on my radar either until I kind of went down that rabbit hole. So this article is kind of highlighting the fact that, like, hey, there's shit going on in other parts of the world, particularly the Middle East. And the main narrative here, though, I guess, is a little frustrating to me because I think rather than denouncing foreign intervention, this is primarily just used as a justification for why we should get involved in more foreign intervention, right? So their argument here is that, like, the underlying argument here is that, racism and Canada, that we view the Middle East as constantly being an area of conflict. Now, the Middle East is an area of constant conflict, arguably because of a lot of the shenanigans the West, America, and NATO get into in the Middle East. So again, I'm not saying that they're at fault for constantly being in conflict, but hey, they are constantly in conflict. But the way this is framed is that, like, oh, look, people are willing to accept, European or Ukrainian refugees, but they don't want to accept Middle East refugees. Again, very complex situation here that we need to break down into multiple pieces. But let's first really just look at and understand that, like, a lot of individuals that are criticizing what's going on in Ukraine and criticizing the fact that we're essentially we're removing anyone and everyone that would challenge the mainstream narrative. It isn't that we're saying like, hey, we want to get involved in conflicts in Yemen. Hey, we want to get involved in conflicts in Ethiopia. It's actually more of an isolationist approach of like, hey, let's actually take a step back. It seems like every time we get involved in these foreign entanglements, we actually leave those countries worse off. Straight up, right? Like, list the number of countries that we got involved in that are as fucked up or more fucked up than we initially started, and list the countries that are less fucked up and in a better position today than they were before we got involved. It's pretty obvious that really the lion's share is in the countries that we left as bad or worse off once we got involved, right? In recent memory, we can think of things like, I don't know, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, right? Again, it's actually quite hard to find situations where we got involved and it was a lot better off. The individuals in those countries were better off for us being involved. But again, if you guys wanted to read this from the Globe and Mail, link in the video description down below. Next, this is from the Ron Paul Institute, and this is going to bring us into our first black pill story of the day. So essentially, this is talking about the biolabs. Now, we've only briefly mentioned the fact that, as more information is coming out around Hunter Biden's laptop, which it still seems like mainstream media is just choosing to, call a mulligan on. They're like, we're not even going to really pay attention to that story. Let's just skip over it. We got bigger things to fry. Despite the fact that it seems like one of his investment companies played a role in helping finance biolabs in Ukraine. It seems like this biolab stuff is not getting a lot of play in mainstream media. And what I want to highlight here, again, even regardless of what's going on with Ukraine and biolabs, this first paragraph here is really important to understand. The semi-official United States government plus media lie machine knows that constructing a plausible reason to bomb the crap out of someone all depends on where you begin your narrative. If you keep starting your accusations at a point where the target has done something bad, all you have to do is repeat yourself over and over and over again to drown out any alternative backstory that surfaces. And if you really want to demolish all contrary views, all you have to do is liken the target foreign leader to Adolf Hitler and keep repeating. That tactic was used with Saddam Hussein of Iraq and is now being employed against Vladimir Putin of Russia, and it always works. And this really is what we're seeing play out here, right? Because when we start looking at these complex geopolitical situations, it honestly, who's right and who's wrong usually depends on where you start your timeline. Personally, you guys know I'm a huge fanboy of Daryl Cooper from Martyr Made, and when he's exploring the history of Israel and the Israel-Palestine conflict, he starts way back. And it really helps provide context and perspective to this complex situation. Now, again, does that mean that you immediately understand who's right and who's wrong in that conflict? No. But it certainly presents a much more comprehensive view of what's going on than what we normally get in our soundbite media from the corporate press and legacy media. And so specifically here, what I want to highlight is, even with this Ukraine-Russia conflict, where do you start, right? Do you start the day Putin's army rolled in 2022? Because in that case, yeah, very obvious. Russia bad, Ukraine good. But do we start at the end of 2014 once kind of the semi-committed ceasefire occurred and the 14,000 individuals that died in the conflict from 2014 to 2022? Because in which case it gets a little bit harder to tell, right? Or do we start right before the Maidenpool Revolution? Because again, in that situation, with the 2014 revolution, it's like, oh, well, it seems like the US and the CIA were deeply involved in pushing this, right? Oh, it seems like neo-Nazis were also involved or the Azimov brigade or battalion were involved in this as well, and they were definitely the backbone of the fighting side of this revolution that occurred. So do you start there? Or do you go back to, was it 2004, which was the Orange Revolution, which again appears to have been a kind of a U.S. propped up color revolution? Or do we start, and once you start really pulling on that thread, you start to realize like the narrative often is just very selective from our politicians, right? They're just going to pick the narrative that fits within the sound bites they want created. So in this case, essentially all history is forgotten other than the moment Putin's army invaded Ukraine. Now, again, that's not to, this isn't to, try and justify his actions, but to better understand these complex geopolitical situations. Because again, time and time again, we get dragged into these foreign entanglements with barely an understanding of what's actually going on, and everything spirals out of control. Budgets, timelines, casualties, they all seem to expand, right? The same way that with like government agencies, the level of growth of government agency is only restricted based upon their budgets. The more money you give a government agency, wouldn't you know it, the bigger it grows. And the same thing is true with all these foreign entanglements that we find ourselves in. Again, I think this is a great article. I encourage you to read it cover to cover, but just wanted to highlight that in particular. Next from the Ron Paul Institute, Red Alert, what seeing the war in Syria taught me about U.S. Western government and media propaganda. And what's interesting right now, I saw there was an op-ed piece, I believe, in Globe and Mail, where they were discussing why hasn't Russia's propaganda machine won the war in Ukraine? And it's a multitude of reasons, but what's funny is they highlight 2016, and they're like, oh, in 2016, we all knew Russia's propaganda machine was undefeated. It helped bring Trump in and Trumpism and all this stuff. Again, when you actually go back and look at the amount of Facebook ads that were bought by Russia, I might be slightly off here, but I think we're talking less than $50,000 or $60,000, right? Total spent. Well, like I used to have an education company where, 1 month we spent $200,000 on Facebook ads. And again, we weren't making a massive splash. Everyone in Canada doesn't know my name or know that company's name. And so to think that, the Russia propaganda machine was this behemoth, this almost insurmountable thing, and yet somehow the West defeated it because of Ukraine, I think overlooks the fact that the most powerful propaganda machine in the world is of the United States, right? It's Hollywood, it's U.S. culture, it's Project Mockingbird, it's all that. Or is it Operation Mockingbird? I always confuse the words project and operation. I think it was Operation Mockingbird, wasn't it? But anyways, from the Ron Paul Institute, it became clear that what's been happening in Syria was not a spontaneous, organic, popular uprising against the tyrant, but a proxy regime change attempt war in the works since the mid-2000s against the quite popular Assad. This effort was spearheaded by the US, UK, France, and Israel using Sunni violent fundamentalists and extremists, unpopular with majority of Syria's Sunni population, as well as minority groups, armed and funded by the West and regional allies of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar. To start the violence and do the dirty work. The basic character of the rebel groups was apparent from the beginning. Syrian and non-Syrian fighters, most Westerners would call terrorists and be screaming for their government to crush if the same heavily armed groups had taken over their cities, towns, and suburbs by massacring, beheading, torturing, kidnapping, and raping. So again, this is just an interesting perspective on what went down in Syria. And while it's not going to be perfectly analogous to what's going on in Ukraine, I personally feel like if you understand enough about history, you start to see these patterns repeating themselves, right? And it feels like we constantly are making the same mistakes as a country, as a culture, as world leaders, if you will, based upon how the West views themselves. So again, really encourage you guys, check out that Ron Paul Institute article. Next from Rebel News, Trudeau's foreign affairs minister says her job is to censor Canadian media. Now, this is something we covered yesterday, but I thought Rebel News here did a good point of highlighting a couple other things that I wanted to bring up. So first here, the Department of Canadian Heritage in a technical paper last July 29th proposed to appoint a chief censor called the Digital Safety Commissioner to police a safe, open, and inclusive internet where Canadians feel they can express themselves without being victimized or targeted by certain kinds of harmful content. The censor would advise Cabinet on content moderation, it said. Again, this idea that we want to have censor SARS, right? That we want to have government officials deciding what is true, what's false, and what's presentable to the Joe Q public tells you everything you need to know about how much they respect our intelligence, right? They do not think that we're intelligent enough to actually do our own research. They do not think we're intelligent enough to essentially come to our own conclusions based upon facts and reasoning. And when we look at the history, right, we just covered it yesterday with CBC News issuing 33 corrections or retractions over the last year. Again, no one gets it right 100% of the time. Doesn't matter what news outlet we're talking about. However, what is frustrating is when we see mainstream media, when we see Canadian politicians and the administration pretending like they're always right. I would much more respect someone that actually approach things with even just an ounce of humility, right? With an ounce of understanding that, hey, we're never going to get perfect. Even when it comes to like budgets, right? This, and we're going to see the headlines roll out over the next week about how they're going to promise us everything and somehow they're going to do it for less money than they've done in the past. And it's like, no, we can't, you don't get it all, right? There's that classic saying in like business, cost, time, quality, right? Those are the three factors. You can have two, but you can't have all three. And the same holds true when it comes to our government, right? Government programs and everything of that nature. And yet, over the next week, we're just going to see promise after promise thrown at us from politicians, and the mainstream media is just going to lap it up and applaud without any critical questioning or understanding of what's actually going on. Further on in the Rebel News article, they highlight, however, the liberal politicians and mainstream media tend to see Russians hiding under every bid. And so this is in regards to essentially the idea of if we were to implement a censor czar here in Canada, like understand that they often tell us one thing and then it turns out actually not to be true, right? Remember, we had multiple Canadian politicians talking about Russian influence, right? About how Trumpism was hijacking Canadian discourse in Canadian society under the guise of the Freedom Trucker Convoy. And yet, once actually reports came out, once we heard from experts in regards to what's going on with the actual money that flowed in to both the GoFundMe and Give, Send, Go campaigns, it turned out, oh no, actually the vast majority of money came from Canadians. Actually, there weren't huge individual single donors. It turns out that I think the average donation was what, like $73 or $75? And the average donor was a Canadian. And yet, again, we get gaslit time and time again by our government officials. So in a February 17th press conference, Emergency Preparedness Minister Bill Blair pointed to the Freedom Convoy as an example of foreign interference in Canadian politics. Direct quote, "We will not let any foreign entities that seek to do harm to Canada or Canadians erode faith in our democratic institutions or question the legitimacy of our democracy," Blair claimed. Now, again, that's not true. It's just factually incorrect. And yet no one's really going to hold Bill Blair to task for this, right? We're just going to move on because we've got the Ukraine narrative, we've got a budget, we've got other things to worry about, and yet there's never any consequences for our politicians. Now, getting into our first clown pill story of the day, and this one's particularly funny and weird, in my opinion, because, again, social media and mainstream media, it's so hard to understand what's true, what's fiction, what's a troll. Dimwit Trudeau lieutenant thinks Poilievre is photoshopping massive rallies. So if you guys didn't see Pierre Poilievre before he came to London, Ontario and bought his shawarma with Bitcoin, he was actually down in Windsor, I believe. I actually think this is the exact same venue that we hosted OREC 2019 in Windsor, or Win City OREC, I should say. That's what we called it. But essentially, I'll let Adam Vaughn bury himself here, but one of the hardest parts of Photoshop is getting the shadows right. They are all in the same room, or are they? This many shadows from different angles is odd, especially when sunlight outside is backlighting the range of exposures and angles. Sergeant Pepper Lonely Candidates Band. So essentially, reading between the lines here, he's implying, I guess, that Pierre Poilievre's audience was photoshopped here and that Pierre is actually a lonely candidate who can't draw large crowds. Understand it's reported that over 1,200 Canadians came out to support him. Something that's pretty rare in this day and age when it comes to any sort of Canadian politicians' rallies, but particularly when there's not actually an election ongoing. A few people kind of took him to task on this, but what's really strange is, like, there's literal videos, right, of this event. And so, again, could in theory these be crazy deepfakes? Anything's possible in this timeline. However, I honestly don't think Pierre Poilievre has the budget for crazy deepfakes when it comes to this. I think Occam's razor really dictates here that, it's actually probably just a lot of people support Pierre Poilievre. Again, it may even be that a lot of people don't support Pierre Poilievre, but they're just sick and tired and frustrated by the status quo, right? By Justin Trudeau and his lackeys, by the Liberals and NDP merger. I could honestly understand if a lot of people there were just like, honestly, I'm just pissed off. And I just want to show up and feel like I'm part of something. Kind of feel like that's almost what happened with the Freedom Trucker convoy protesters, right? A lot of Canadians were just like, honestly, I'm just fed up. I'm just pissed off. And I need an outlet for it. Yeah. I think that honestly, if we see Pierre Poilievre continue to play politics the way he does, I think we're going to see a large grassroots movement crop up around him, because there's a lot of frustrated Canadians out there and they don't know where to direct their energies. Now, I'm not saying that he's going to be the candidate that saves Canada, because sadly, I don't think there's a single politician that could save Canada, but he certainly could maybe help triage the bleeding. Maybe he'll be able to slow down the spread of tyranny in Canada. Love to hear your thoughts, your opinions. Now, again, he is a career politician, so I don't know. Anyone that's a career politician is automatically suspect on my list, but hey, at least he talks nice about Bitcoin. And now getting into our first white pill story of the day. This is from fee.org. The exodus from U.S. cities is gaining speed, new census data shows. The pattern here is clear. Americans are fleeing highly regulated, highly taxed areas and flocking to freer states. Now, the reason I decided to frame this as a white pill is because, one, I often struggle to find white pills. But secondly, essentially, one, I just want to remind you guys, I did it before it was cool, fleeing large metropolitan urban centers. Two, I think you guys should probably consider doing that too. I think that no matter what plays out next in society, you won't regret it. Three, I thought it was funny that there's a giant tube TV here. Who the hell would move with a tube TV? In this day and age, no, you're just going to leave that shit behind. But I guess one of the reasons I did want to highlight this is it obviously shows that there's more than just a handful of individuals that understand something's wrong, right? Something's not working anymore with our large urban centers. Maybe it's too much regulation, right? Maybe it's too much wokeness or social justice warriors. Maybe it's too much virtue signaling rather than actually having virtues, right? Or ethics and morals underlying who you are, what your personal character is. So again, just thought this was interesting. I suspect that we'll see similar trends here in Canada. Now, one thing to understand that maybe sways thing a bit in Canada is the large percentage of immigrants we have, and the fact that when you look at statistics, most immigrants, when they first land in Canada, they're going to naturally go to those large urban centers, right? So like they're usually going to the Torontos, the Vancouvers, the Montreals to get their footing before considering spreading out in Canada. So that may slightly restrict or slow down the statistics here and not make it quite as apparent. But anecdotally speaking, I definitely know lots of individuals that either are moving out from large urban centers to, the suburbs, or moving from the suburbs into more, rural settings. I personally think that it's justifiable for a multitude of reasons. One, I think that your cost of living, usually you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck if you're living in a rural setting. Two, the vast majority of like information workers or individuals that work on their computer all day, they can telecommute or find alternatives where they can be contractors there. So again, they can kind of work around a lot of those things. Then beyond that, sorry, I just got a weird notification on my screen. I was like, I hope no one else sees that. And you didn't. So we're all good. But beyond that, I think one of the other factors here is simply people wanting more control over their lives, right? So when you get into that rural setting, it's a lot easier to disconnect from the mainstream. So one, you can't get Uber Eats when you're out in the sticks. Two, you actually get to know your neighbors and you get to know your community a lot better. And it just becomes natural to want to plant deeper roots. Where I think in those large metro urban centers, it's easy to feel like you're just kind of floating on the surface rather than really committing to anything and everything. And so again, I think we're going to see at least a segment of the population focusing on wanting to return to traditional values. I think step one for a lot of people is putting themselves in a environment and an ecosystem or situation where they can surround themselves with similar like-minded individuals. And, anecdotally speaking, up here at the Citadel, there's certainly a lot more like-minded individuals around me today in my extended community than there was back when I was living in London, Ontario. So again, link to this article on fee.org if you're interested. The next one here, Sweden, once mocked for its COVID strategy, now has one of the lowest COVID mortality rates in Europe. Sweden, which avoided strict lockdowns, now has a lower COVID mortality rate than 29 countries in Europe alone. And yeah, this is something we've chatted about multiple times on the Maple Pill. It's probably been a while since I brought up Sweden, because I feel like since the news cycle went so hard on the Freedom Trucker Convoy and then Ukraine, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about COVID policies. But I understand Sweden did it right. They took a laissez-faire approach, which should always be the default approach rather than an authoritarian approach, modeling China, right? Why the hell would we choose China to be the model? But I guess one thing that I thought this article in particular did a great job of was highlighting all the misinformation around Sweden's approach, right? So, from Foreign Policy in December, the inside story of how Sweden botched its coronavirus response. From Forbes, Sweden stayed open and more people died of COVID-19, but the real reason may be something darker. From France 24, Sweden's COVID-19 strategy has caused an amplification of the epidemic. From Chicago Policy Review, Sweden's unconventional approach to COVID-19, what went wrong? And New York Times, Sweden has become the world's cautionary tale. And these are just a few of the examples, essentially showing the hardcore criticism from every media outlet in the world, essentially, because there was a narrative to push here. I don't know how else to frame this, right? But let's look at the other side of the story. So this author, I spent a great deal of time in 2020 and 2021 arguing that the media was getting the narrative wrong on Sweden, pointing out that Sweden's response had resulted in exponentially fewer deaths than the modelers had predicted and lower mortality overall than most of Europe. And again, he goes on to just share some great facts and statistics around it. I really encourage you guys, if you're so inclined, to go down this rabbit hole and spend a bit of time here. But the other factor that all those headlines that I just read off ignored was the cost of lockdowns, right? We've talked about the mental health impacts, the learning disabilities, and in my opinion, how if we haven't, we came to the precipice of sacrificing an entire generation of children in the hopes of some sort of perceived safety, right? There's serious consequences to this, not to mention just the economic impact of retarding and slowing down businesses for the last 2 years. And again, it created a huge wealth divide, right? We saw billionaires getting richer than ever before at a faster rate of accumulating wealth, while we saw a lot of people left behind and struggling to make ends meet. Not because they didn't want to work, not because they couldn't work, not because they weren't capable of working, but simply because the government decided they couldn't work. So again, encourage you guys to spend some time on this, but the lesson of secondary consequences. So public officials made two serious mistakes above all others in their response to the virus. The first was assuming they possessed the knowledge and ability to contain a highly contagious respiratory virus through lockdowns and other NPIs. The second mistake public officials made was not considering the unintended consequences of their actions. The writer and economist Henry Hazlitt once pointed out that this is one of the perennial flaws in policy making. Yeah, because again, secondary consequences and unintended consequences, they don't, if the mainstream media doesn't pick it up, it's essentially like it didn't exist, right? And the politicians already moved on to their next headline, their next narrative, their next stump speech. And so we never do get to hold these people accountable, and it drives me crazy. But it is nice to at least see an article coming out and, breaking down what actually went down in Sweden and highlighting the fact that, no, Sweden's not a cautionary tale. In fact, the rest of the world's a cautionary tale for Sweden. Now, I want to highlight this. In theory, I could view this as definitely a black pill story, but I'm going to choose to see it as a white pill. So this is David Moskrop, and I actually forget what David's claim to fame is. He's author of Too Dumb for Democracy, which the irony there is wonderful. I don't even know what that book's about, but the irony is obvious to me without even going down that rabbit hole. So essentially, he was calling out Pierre Poilievre because of his support of Bitcoin. And, tell me you're not going to make it without telling me you're not going to make it. And this thread's a perfect example. So many people are going to lose so much money while cynical politicians get away with advocating fringe policies they learned about on YouTube. I feel like David's probably total extent of exposure to understanding Bitcoin is probably watching like one news pundit, right? Or reading one mainstream media news article. Polyev, elect me Google's prime minister, and I'll tackle Google's inflation by logs onto YouTube, freeing the economy with the power of space bucks. Again, this is honestly embarrassing that someone so misunderstands Bitcoin at this point in time, and yet is still so confident in speaking out against it. And now, you may be asking, Matt, I thought you said this was a white pill story. So why are you just highlighting how, Canadian mainstream media is retarded when it comes to Bitcoin? How's that a net benefit? Well, here's the thing, guys. The reason this is a net benefit, the reason this is a white pill story, is because at least these stupid fucks are going to be too egotistical to ever actually examine what Bitcoin is, to ever do their own research, to ever read books like the Bitcoin Standard, the Fiat Standard, the Bullish Case for Bitcoin, all the fantastic resources that we've mentioned on this YouTube channel in the past. So the great thing is, these guys are going to stay no coiners. They're never actually going to stack sats. And that means right now, if you've literally stacked $5 worth of Bitcoin this year, you're going to end up on a long enough time horizon. Maybe it's going to be 5, maybe it's going to be 20 years from now, but you're going to end up far more wealthy and more powerful than David Moscrop because you're not financially illiterate. You're actually open and willing to explore new ideas. And so again, the reason this is a white pill story is because David and all his ridiculous commenters in the comment section that honestly don't understand anything about modern monetary theory. Again, some of them were like, I can't. It makes me so angry to even think about what some of them were saying, and their confidence in MMT is just wild in my opinion. But then beyond that, talking about inflation, and it's very clear these people don't actually understand what inflation is or what causes inflation. And mind you, there is a handful of Bitcoiners in here that tried to fix the internet and correct all the stupidity that was going on. But yeah, it's honestly just wild to think about it because it just, in this day and age, in 2022, it's still the mainstream media's narrative that like Bitcoin is magic internet money and it's stupid and it's a Ponzi scheme. Nope, fiat's the Ponzi scheme. So again, encourage you guys, if you want to laugh and if you want to make yourself feel better about your position in the global hierarchy or in Canada's hierarchy, again, literally go stack a couple sats, put $5 into Bitcoin, and in 20 years from now, you're going to be in a much better spot financially than any of the morons in this comment section that literally know nothing about economics, inflation, or Bitcoin for that matter. And yet they've got no concerns about being an armchair quarterback and calling it, Ponzi scheme about how all these old boomers that follow Polyev are going to be bankrupt because of his advice. Again, it just blows my mind. You can not like Pierre Polyev. You can even not like Bitcoin, but at least be mildly informed when it comes to these subject matters. Finally, let's wrap up with a meme of the day. So this is from Sal the Agorist. When they're talking about how prohibition laws never worked, and you remind them that technically all laws are prohibition laws that haven't worked. Yeah, that literally feels like me more often than not when it comes to government, where I'm like, no, like government doesn't work. It's not because the Reds are in charge, or it's not because the Oranges are in charge, or it's not because the Blues aren't, or the Purples aren't. It's literally government's the problem. That's the common denominator here is government is almost always the problem, or is almost always the cause of all the problems you're experiencing. The government's almost always responsible for all the problems that you're encountering on a day-to-day life. Now, does that mean that we live in a utopia without government? No, but we'd at least be one step closer to it. So again, appreciate you guys hanging out with me on this Tuesday night. Hope you enjoyed this episode of The Maple Pill. If you are, consider smashing that like button. If you haven't subscribed on YouTube, it'd be really cool if you did, because I'd love to get to 1,000 subs before I get deleted off of YouTube. And hey, we're only 14 subs away. And once you guys get me to 1,000 subs, I promise to never talk about you getting me to 1,000 subs again. So it's kind of a win-win at this point in time. If you guys want to follow me on Instagram, it's Matt McKeever Unfiltered. Right there's the link. Essentially just me posting shit posting memes and, ranting and raving about how the government's the cause of most of our problems. But before we wrap up, I really do appreciate the fact that you guys make this a two-way conversation by interacting in that chat section. So let's pull it up here. We've got Graham in the chat. We've got Farzana. We've got JJ. We've got Free Faster. What's up, everyone? Free Faster saying he's all variable and he still doesn't care. That's fantastic. Free, I'm guessing you've got some good cash flow on your rental properties. That's one of the easiest ways to not care and be insulated from potential interest rate hikes. Brenda says, I'm a realtor and now is a good time to buy because there are many listings getting few or zero offers. However, I anticipate the market will pick up again in April. Appreciate you sharing what you're seeing, Brenda. Farzana, where people have variable rate mortgages and the monthly payments tend to remain the same with a reallocation between principal and interest, I can't see them panicking with increased rates. No, I think that the primary driver there is that people will then start being forced or deciding to want to get fixed rates. And when like new buyers are entering the market and they're trying to qualify, if they're trying to qualify at these new higher rates and they're looking to get fixed rates because they're scared of further interest rate hikes, that's going to see their affordability shrink, right? So they're going to be able to buy less real estate in general. Farzana, but for those that will have their payments go up and don't have a lot of equity in their house, it won't be good. And if there are many such situations, it will not look good for the economy. Agree. Terry says, watching maple pills while boiling maple sap. There you go. Nothing more Canuck than that. And we've tapped a couple birch trees around the Citadel, so we'll see how that goes. How do they get away with these things? I'm not even sure what you're referring to there, Benjamin, but I 100% agree. How do they get away with any of the things they get away with? Graham says, let's replace the F-35 fighter jets with a couple dozen Avro arrows. You guys remember that? That's a deep ref, Graham. Probably a lot of the Gen Zers won't even get the reference. Sup, y'all? Hey, Al. Bye, everyone. Have to run. We'll catch the replay on Rumble. Appreciate it, Farzana. JJ, everyone keeps talking about Azov Battalion, but forgetting about the government being OUNB. I'm not even sure what that means. Are you talking about the Ukrainian government or our government? The sad truth is the government knows that the majority isn't intelligent enough to do their own research. It's better to count on the majority. Agree. Al says Pierre Polyev used Russian hackers to create visual disinformation. Coming to a CBC article near you soon, paid for by your tax dollars. Graham says, I trust Pierre about as far as I can throw him. Actually, that's not even accurate. Rumors are it's difficult to figure out who his parents are, and his wife's history is also allegedly mysterious. Interesting. I have not gone down that rabbit hole. Terry says, I've grown up and always lived in the boonies. It's a harder way of living for most, but I grew up there and comes very natural to me. Wouldn't have it any other way. Al says, right there with you, Graham. I don't trust him for a sec. Liberal Party is just going to lateral the football right into his hands to carry the agenda forward, in my opinion. Well, again, appreciate you guys hanging out with me on this Tuesday night. Those of you that share this on social media, it really does mean a lot because we know big tech's going to do me no favors and, they're not going to spread this show. But the fact that you guys hang out with me every single weekday night while we chat about all the craziness that is Canadian politics means a lot to me. So again, I appreciate you guys. I'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here for another episode of the Maple Pill. And reminder, if you guys want to send me mail, we'll do another Mailbag Monday next Monday. And let's play the mailbag song as we head out. See you guys. All right, mailbag song. The audio is not working. Let's do the normal Maple Pill outro then.
Asking blue pill, red pill, corporate press, I've had my fill. I'm just a simple chap, believing in my own will. Web fire, math, evil, scheming, this is no drill. Haters masking boost.